These are 20 hidden facts about Rio Grande that reveal how John Ford's most reluctant Western became an accidental masterpiece. The 1950 film that completed Ford's Cavalry trilogy holds secrets that even die-hard fans have never heard. From dangerous stunts performed without doubles to behind-the-scenes battles that nearly shut down production. Those of us who grew up watching John Wayne ride across the silver screen know Rio Grande holds a special place in our hearts. The film marked Duke's first pairing with the fiery Maureen O'Hara, setting the stage for one of cinema's greatest on-screen romances, but the real drama wasn't happening in front of the camera. What went on behind the scenes proved far more compelling than anything in James Kevin McGinnis's screenplay. Fact number 1. John Ford never wanted to make this film. It was the price of admission to finance The Quiet Man. Something might surprise you about how this film came to exist. John Ford, one of Hollywood's greatest directors, was essentially blackmailed into making Rio Grande. And this wasn't a passion project or even a film he wanted on his resume. The deal he struck was with the devil himself, and the devil's name was Herbert Yates. Yates ran Republic Pictures and held all the cards when Ford desperately wanted to make The Quiet Man, a romantic Irish comedy that had been his dream project for years. Yates dismissed it outright and called it a silly little Irish story that will never make a penny. And Ford's son Patrick later reported that his father didn't want to make Rio Grande. He didn't want any part of it. The bargain they struck worked like this. Ford would deliver a profitable Western first, using the same director, producer, and cast that would later appear in The Quiet Man, and then Yates would finance the Irish picture. Ford agreed but demanded one condition that gave him creative control even when he couldn't control whether he made the film at all, and his words were simple: "If I can have my choice of cast, I'll make it for you." Production costs were capped at just over $1.2 million, roughly half what Ford had spent on Ford Apache 2 years earlier, which meant the film had to be shot in black and white instead of the expensive Technicolor process used for She Wore a Yellow Ribbon. Every penny mattered because this was a business transaction dressed up as filmmaking. Fact number 2. John Wayne didn't want to make it either. It was just another paycheck. Ford wasn't the only one who felt trapped by this production, and that's something people don't realize. John Wayne, the biggest Western star in Hollywood, had no enthusiasm for Rio Grande whatsoever, and Patrick Ford put it bluntly when he admitted Duke didn't really want to make it. It was just a job. By 1950, Wayne had already appeared in 2 of Ford's Cavalry films, Ford Apache and She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, which meant he knew the drill and understood Ford's methods. Working for the director meant enduring psychological warfare disguised as filmmaking, because Ford had a notorious habit of belittling and insulting his actors, and Wayne was frequently the target. Maureen O'Hara witnessed Ford's behavior firsthand and described it as vicious and extremely severe, watching him insult and humiliate Wayne throughout production in a pattern that had repeated itself on every Ford picture. Wayne kept coming back and kept taking the abuse because he respected Ford's talent and knew the director brought out his best work, but respect doesn't equal enthusiasm. Wayne was a professional who showed up and did the work, delivering a performance that Scott Amon would later praise as equal parts steel and grace, the burden of responsibility leavened by the realization of what that responsibility has cost him. That's the mark of a true craftsman, someone who can create art even when his heart isn't in it. Fact number 3. Wayne gave up his 10% profit participation to help meet the restricted budget. This fact reveals something about John Wayne's character that goes beyond his screen persona, showing a side of Duke that most people never knew existed. Despite his reluctance to make the film and the insulting treatment from Ford, Wayne made a financial sacrifice that cost him dearly in the long run. Republic Pictures set the budget ceiling at $1.25 million with no room for negotiation, and Ford needed every advantage he could get. Wayne made a decision that would cost him a fortune when he gave up his 10% profit participation to help the production succeed. Let's put that in perspective for a moment. Rio Grande earned $2.25 million in its first year, which meant 10% of those profits would have netted Wayne a substantial sum, likely more than $100,000, and in 1950 that was serious money. Wayne walked away from all of it without a second thought. The reason makes sense when you understand the bigger picture. Rio Grande's failure meant The Quiet Man would never get made, and The Quiet Man meant everything to Ford because the Irish romance would give his director a chance to show a different side of his talent, stepping away from Monument Valley and Cavalry charges to tell a story about love and family and homecoming. Wayne took the financial hit and accepted his straight salary with nothing more, demonstrating an act of loyalty and friendship that went largely unrecognized at the time. Decades later, when film historians examined the production records, this sacrifice came to light and showed the kind of man Wayne was off-screen, generous to a fault, loyal to his friends, and willing to put the greater good ahead of his own interests. Fact number 4. Maureen O'Hara was only 14 years older than her on-screen son, Claude Jarman Jr. Hollywood has always played fast and loose with age, but this casting decision stretches credibility to the breaking point in ways that are hard to ignore. Maureen O'Hara was 29 years old when she played Kathleen York, the estranged wife of John Wayne's cavalry officer, while Claude Jarman Jr., who played their son Jefferson, was nearly 16, creating a gap of just 14 years between mother and son. The math doesn't work when you think about it. O'Hara's character would have had to give birth when she was 14 years old, and even by the standards of the 1800s, when the script mentions that Kathleen and Kirby York married young, this timeline doesn't add up. Casting wasn't about realism, though, and that's what people need to understand. O'Hara was part of the package deal Ford had negotiated with Yates because she was slated to star in The Quiet Man opposite Wayne, which meant putting her in Rio Grande served as a test run for their on-screen partnership, and that partnership turned out to be pure gold. The age gap didn't seem to bother audiences in 1950, and O'Hara possessed a timeless quality that allowed her to play older or younger depending on the role. Her performance as Kathleen conveyed years of heartbreak and separation, showing a woman worn down by 15 years of loneliness and regret, and you believed she was the mother of a teenage son even if the calendar said otherwise. And if those first few facts have surprised you, make sure to hit that subscribe button because we've got 16 more revelations coming that will change how you see this classic Western forever. Fact number 5. Wayne wore a deliberately smaller toupee to make his character appear older. John Wayne was famously sensitive about his hairline, and by 1950 he'd been wearing hairpieces on screen for years without most audiences noticing, because the toupees were expertly crafted and blended seamlessly with his natural hair. Rio Grande saw Wayne make an interesting choice that reveals his commitment to character in ways most actors wouldn't bother with. The toupee he wore was deliberately smaller than usual, creating the appearance of a receding hairline that added years to his appearance. Lieutenant Colonel Kirby York was supposed to be a man weathered by decades of frontier service, someone who'd sacrificed his youth and his marriage to military duty, and every detail mattered in creating that impression. Wayne was 43 during filming and played a character who'd graduated from West Point before the Civil War and spent 15 years in the cavalry afterward, which meant the smaller toupee helped bridge that gap. Combined with the harsh Utah sunlight, the dust on his uniform, and the lines of weariness in his face, it created a convincing portrait of a man ground down by responsibility. This attention to detail extended to other aspects of Wayne's appearance in ways that show how seriously he took the role. Wayne refused the studio's offer of a fresh uniform and insisted on the same dusty, sweat-stained costume throughout production, and Ford had mandated that actors were forbidden to wash their cavalry uniforms, a rule designed to create authenticity that Wayne embraced completely. Fact number 6. Patrick Wayne made his UN-credited film debut, and audiences never knew they were watching a real father and son. One of the most charming secrets hidden in Rio Grande involves John Wayne's 11-year-old son Patrick, who appears in the film completely uncredited, and most viewers had no idea they were watching an actual Wayne family scene play out on screen. Patrick Wayne's scenes are brief but memorable when he appears as one of the children captured by Apache raiders and later rescued by the cavalry. There's a particularly poignant moment during the final sequence where you can spot him among the rescued children, and if you look closely you can see the family resemblance with the same strong jaw and the same direct gaze that would later make Patrick a Western star in his own right. Ford had a habit of using his actors' children in small roles as part of his stock company approach to filmmaking, creating a family atmosphere on set, even when conditions were brutal. Patrick's older brother Michael had already appeared in several Ford films, and younger brother Ethan would follow in later years, which meant being in a John Ford picture was almost a rite of passage for the Wayne children. What makes this particularly special is that Patrick was watching his father work at the height of his powers, and Wayne's performance in Rio Grande is subtle and nuanced, showing a man trying to balance duty with love and authority with compassion. Young Patrick got a masterclass in film acting just by being on set and watching his father navigate Ford's demanding direction to create a character that would endure for generations. Fact number 7. 3 actors learned Roman riding in just 3 weeks and performed the dangerous stunt themselves with no doubles. Now we get to one of the most astonishing behind-the-scenes stories from Rio Grande, a stunt so dangerous that no modern production would ever allow actors to perform it themselves. Roman riding, for those unfamiliar with the technique, is essentially water skiing on horses where the rider stands with one foot on each of two galloping horses, controlling both animals while maintaining balance at high speed. 3 weeks before filming began, John Ford called Claude Jarman Jr. with a simple question about whether he'd ever done Roman riding, and Jarman, who'd grown up in Nashville, Tennessee, admitted he hadn't. Ford's response was characteristically blunt when he told him, "Well, you've got 3 weeks to learn." Jarman wasn't the only one facing this crash course, because Ben Johnson and Harry Carey Jr. also had to master the technique in the same compressed time frame. All three were experienced riders, and Johnson had been a champion rodeo cowboy before becoming an actor. But Roman riding was a completely different skill set that required perfect timing, extraordinary balance, and absolute trust in your horses. Those 3 weeks saw the actors practice relentlessly, falling and getting back up and falling again until they gradually developed the muscle memory and coordination needed to make it look effortless. By the time production started in mid-June of 1950, all three could perform the stunt convincingly enough to fool audiences into thinking they'd been doing it for years. The crucial detail that makes this fact remarkable is simple. They actually did it themselves in the film with no stunt doubles and no camera tricks beyond careful framing. When you watch that sequence where 3 cavalry troopers demonstrate Roman riding for the other soldiers, those are genuinely Ben Johnson, Harry Carey Jr. and Claude Jarman Jr. standing on galloping horses. Fact number 8. Ford filmed the Roman riding stunt in a long shot, so audiences would assume stuntmen were used. Ford's genius as a director comes into play here because he knew that audiences seeing the Roman riding sequence in close-up would be distracted trying to figure out if those were really the actors or stunt doubles. The deliberate choice he made enhanced both the realism and the mystery of the scene in ways that protected everyone involved. Ford shot the entire Roman riding demonstration in long shot with the camera positioned far enough away that you can clearly see the stunt being performed, but can't make out facial details with absolute certainty. The composition is beautiful, with 3 riders moving in perfect synchronization across the Utah landscape, while the assembled cavalry troopers watch in admiration. This framing served multiple purposes that show how carefully Ford thought about everything. First, it made the stunt look routine and almost casual, and by keeping the camera distant, Ford suggested that this was just another skill in the cavalry troopers' repertoire rather than the death-defying feat it actually was. Second, it protected his actors, because if anyone in the studio hierarchy questioned whether it was safe to let Johnson, Carey, and Jarman perform the stunt themselves, Ford could point to the long shot and claim he'd used professionals. Most importantly, though, the long shot made audiences believe they were watching stuntmen, and for decades viewers assumed that doubles had performed the Roman riding while the actors were filmed separately in closer shots. That was the smart assumption, and the safe assumption, but it was completely wrong. Harry Carey Jr. loved this deception, and would watch Rio Grande with audiences years later, smiling to himself when the Roman riding scene came on, because he knew everyone assumed they were watching stuntmen when they were actually watching 3 actors who'd learned the skill in less than a month. That secret knowledge made him proud in ways that going public about it never would have. Fact number 9. Ben Johnson told Ford to go to hell and didn't work for him again for 13 years. John Ford's psychological cruelty toward his actors is well documented in Hollywood history, but most of them endured it silently. John Wayne took the abuse, Ward Bond took it, and Harry Carey Jr. took it because they all believed that Ford's genius justified his behavior, that the humiliation was somehow part of the creative process. Ben Johnson disagreed with that whole arrangement. The incident happened during dinner one evening in Moab, Utah, when the cast and crew were eating together as Ford insisted they do. Ford started needling Johnson with snide remarks, using the kind of petty insults he employed to establish dominance and keep everyone off balance. And maybe he questioned Johnson's acting ability, or made fun of his Oklahoma accent. But the specific words don't matter as much as what happened next. Johnson, a former rodeo champion who'd grown up hard in the Cherokee Nation, had no tolerance for bullies, and quietly told Ford where he could put his picture before walking away from the table. That kind of direct defiance was almost unheard of in Ford's company, because the director expected obedience and even submission, but Johnson gave him neither. The consequences were immediate and lasted for years. After Rio Grande wrapped, Johnson didn't appear in another Ford film for 13 years, and that's an eternity in Hollywood time. Ford made more than a dozen pictures during that period, including The Quiet Man, The Searchers, and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and Johnson could have been in any of them, but Ford held a grudge. Fact number 10. Ford put off the kiss scene between Wayne and O'Hara until the final day of filming because he hated directing romance. John Ford was a master of action, composition, and masculine drama, who could film a cavalry charge like no one else, capture the vastness of Monument Valley in ways that took your breath away, and coax powerful performances from actors in scenes of conflict and camaraderie. Ask him to direct a love scene, though, and the great director became as awkward as a teenage boy at his first dance. Harry Carey Jr. noticed this pattern throughout the production when Ford kept finding reasons to postpone the romantic scenes between Wayne and O'Hara. There was always something more urgent to shoot, whether it was a cavalry drill, a night scene, or an action sequence, anything but the love scene. Wayne complained about it all week with his observation that he's ducking it, he hates to direct a love scene, and Duke was absolutely right. Ford found these moments embarrassing and uncomfortable because he couldn't bring himself to tell his actors how to express tenderness and passion, and the whole business seemed to mortify him. Ford pushed the kiss scene to the absolute last day of filming because he couldn't postpone it any longer without running out of time entirely. The entire production came down to this final moment, with Wayne and O'Hara, Kirby and Kathleen, 15 years of separation finally ending in an embrace. Fact number 11. The Sons of the Pioneers were forced on Ford by studio head Yates, and the director found them incongruous with cavalrymen. Another example of Herbert Yates interfering with Ford's creative vision comes from the studio head's insistence that the Sons of the Pioneers appear in Rio Grande, overriding Ford's strenuous objections. Yates owned Republic Pictures and wanted to showcase talent under contract, and the Sons of the Pioneers were popular and sold records, which meant he saw an opportunity for cross-promotion. Ford hated the idea completely. He found the notion of cowboy singers appearing in a cavalry fort incongruous because this wasn't a singing cowboy picture like the ones Gene Autry and Roy Rogers made for Republic. This was supposed to be a serious military drama about duty and sacrifice, and having a musical group perform numbers broke the fourth wall and undermined the film's realism. Ford had already made his devil's bargain with Yates, though, and he'd agreed to make Rio Grande to finance The Quiet Man, which meant he couldn't fight every battle. The Sons of the Pioneers were written into the script as regimental singers, soldiers who entertained their fellow troopers with songs around the campfire. The group consisted of 6 members: Ken Curtis on lead vocals, Hugh and Carl Farr on bass and guitar, Lloyd Perryman on tenor, Shug Fisher on bugle, and Tommy Doss on baritone. They performed several songs throughout the film, including I'll Take You Home Again, Kathleen, a number whose title directly referenced O'Hara's character. Fact number 12. Ken Curtis, though uncredited, married Ford's daughter and became Festus on Gunsmoke. While Ford resented being forced to use the Sons of the Pioneers, one member of the group made such a favorable impression that he became part of the director's extended family, both literally and professionally. Ken Curtis was the lead singer, a handsome young man with a powerful voice and natural screen presence, and though he appeared uncredited in Rio Grande, he caught Ford's eye. The director recognized something in Curtis beyond his musical talent, seeing an authenticity and humor that would translate well to larger roles. Curtis became a regular in Ford's stock company and appeared in The Searchers, The Horse Soldiers, and several other films, but more significantly, he developed a close relationship with Barbara Ford, the director's daughter who worked as an assistant editor on Rio Grande. They fell in love and eventually married, which made Curtis literally part of the Ford family. Curtis is best remembered today for a role that came years later when he played Festus Hagen on the television series Gunsmoke. He joined the show in 1964 as a replacement for Dennis Weaver's Chester character and remained for 11 seasons, and Festus became one of the most beloved characters in television Western history, a scraggly loyal deputy with a thick accent and a heart of gold. Fact number 13. Actors were forbidden to wash their cavalry uniforms for authenticity. John Ford was obsessed with authenticity and had no patience for Hollywood artifice that undermined realism, and one of his most notorious rules on Rio Grande was simple and non-negotiable. Actors could not wash their cavalry uniforms. This wasn't a suggestion but a mandate enforced throughout the 32-day shoot, which meant the same costume you wore on day 1 would be the same costume you wore on day 32 with accumulated sweat and dust and all. By the end of production, those uniforms looked like they'd been worn by real soldiers on a real campaign because in a sense they had been. The Utah locations made this rule particularly brutal since filming took place in midsummer with temperatures regularly exceeding 90 degrees. The cast spent their days riding horses, rehearsing action sequences, and working in full wool cavalry uniforms under the unforgiving desert sun, and after a week those costumes smelled like a stable. After 2 weeks they were genuinely offensive. That's exactly what Ford wanted, though. He believed that clean, pressed uniforms would make the film look like a costume drama rather than a documentary of frontier life, and real cavalry troopers on the Texas border in 1879 didn't have access to laundries and dry cleaners. They wore the same clothes day after day and accumulated the evidence of their labor. Fact number 14. 50 Navajo actors weren't told they were playing their historical enemies, the Apache. This fact reveals a troubling aspect of Hollywood's treatment of Native Americans, even in productions helmed by directors who would later advocate for indigenous rights. Ford brought 50 Navajo actors from the reservation to play Apache warriors in Rio Grande. And according to Billy Yellow, one of those Navajo performers, they weren't told they were portraying their historical enemies. The Navajo and Apache peoples have distinct cultures, languages, and histories, and while both groups speak languages from the Athabascan family and share some cultural similarities, they've been separate peoples for centuries. More importantly, they were sometimes adversaries during the period depicted in the film, which meant asking Navajo to play Apache without explanation shows either ignorance or indifference to these distinctions. Billy Yellow spoke about this 40 years after the film's release and noted that the Navajo actors only learned they'd been portraying Apache when they finally saw the finished film. Imagine that experience of appearing in a movie, working hard for weeks, and then discovering you'd been cast as your people's historical antagonists without anyone bothering to mention it. Ford would later direct Cheyenne Autumn in 1964, a film that attempted to portray Native Americans with dignity and respect, and he clearly developed a more nuanced understanding of indigenous peoples over time. In 1950, though, making Rio Grande under pressure and on a restricted budget, those considerations seem to have been forgotten. Fact number 15. None of the filming locations are anywhere near the actual Rio Grande River. A geographic irony perfectly captures Hollywood's relationship with truth when you realize that a film called Rio Grande wasn't filmed anywhere near the Rio Grande. Not even close, because every single location was in Utah, hundreds of miles north of the river that gives the film its title. The actual Rio Grande flows through Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas while forming the border between Texas and Mexico, and it's a muddy, powerful river that's been a contested boundary for centuries. The film's story takes place along this border with Apache raiders using Mexico as sanctuary and cavalry forces forbidden from crossing into foreign territory. Ford actually filmed at White's Ranch near Moab, which became the fort exteriors and marked the first movie ever shot at that location. Professor Valley provided the dramatic landscape for cavalry maneuvers. Fisher Towers and Ida Gulch offered the stunning canyon scenery, and the Colorado River, which does flow through Utah, stood in for the Rio Grande and water crossing scenes. These locations were chosen for practical and aesthetic reasons because Monument Valley, Ford's favorite filming location, was relatively close. The red rock formations and dramatic vistas provided the iconic western landscape that audiences expected, and most importantly, Utah was cheaper and easier to access than the actual Texas-Mexico border. Fact number 16. The film reverses actual history. In 1873, the U.S. cavalry kidnapped Native women and children, not vice versa. This might be the most disturbing fact about Rio Grande's relationship with history, because the film's central plot device, Apache warriors kidnapping white children and holding them across the border in Mexico, is based on an actual historical incident. The real story has the roles reversed, though. In May of 1873, Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie led the 4th Cavalry on an unauthorized raid into Mexico, with his target being a Kickapoo village, where warriors had taken refuge after crossing the border. Mackenzie's forces attacked the village, killed several dozen people, and kidnapped Kickapoo women and children as hostages, who were then used as bargaining chips to force the Kickapoo men to surrender and relocate to a reservation. This was a controversial military action even at the time, because Mackenzie crossed an international border without authorization, attacked a civilian village, and took hostages, all actions that violated both U.S. military regulations and international law. The incident nearly caused a diplomatic crisis with Mexico. Rio Grande takes this shameful episode and flips it completely. In James Kevin McGinnis's screenplay, it's the Apache who kidnap children and hold them in Mexico, and it's the cavalry who conduct a rescue mission, saving innocent lives rather than committing what amounts to a war crime. The moral calculus is completely inverted. Fact number 17. Ford told studio head Yates to get the hell off his set when he showed up at 10 a.m. John Ford was famous for starting work early and demanding absolute control over his set. And when Herbert Yates, the Republic Pictures president who'd forced him to make Rio Grande in the first place, showed up at 10 o'clock in the morning to observe filming, the confrontation was inevitable. Ford had been shooting since dawn, as was his custom, because he believed the best light came in the early morning hours and wanted his crew fresh and focused. By the time Yates arrived, Ford had already completed several setups and was deep into the day's work, and the last thing he needed was the studio boss hanging around, asking questions, and disrupting the rhythm. When asked when he intended to start shooting, Ford delivered one of his most famous lines with the simple directive to Yates, "Just as soon as you get the hell off my set." It wasn't a joke or playful banter between colleagues, but a direct order from a director who'd had enough of studio interference. Yates had the power to fire Ford because he owned the studio and controlled the budget, but he also knew that Ford was irreplaceable as the only director who could bring in Rio Grande on schedule and on budget, while maintaining the quality that would make it profitable enough to justify financing The Quiet Man. Yates left and got the hell off Ford's set to let the director work. Fact number 18. The film released during the Korean War and its border-crossing themes mirrored real Cold War tensions. The timing of Rio Grande's release gives the film an unexpected political dimension that audiences in 1950 would have immediately recognized. Filming began in mid-June of that year, the same month North Korea invaded South Korea and launched a war that would eventually involve U.S. forces in a conflict about borders, international law, and the limits of military action. By the time Rio Grande reached theaters on November 15, 1950, the Korean War had escalated dramatically, with Chinese forces entering the conflict, attacking U.S. positions, and pushing United Nations forces back toward the 38th parallel. The question of whether to pursue enemy forces across borders, into North Korea and into China, was being debated in every newspaper and on every radio broadcast. Rio Grande's plot suddenly seemed incredibly relevant to moviegoers. The film's cavalry officers faced the same dilemma that confronted real generals in Korea, asking what you do when enemies use international borders as sanctuary, and if Apache raiders attack American settlers and then flee to Mexico where U.S. forces have no legal authority. How do you stop them? The film's solution to ignore the border and conduct a rescue raid must have resonated with audiences who were hearing similar arguments about pursuing North Korean and Chinese forces. Fact number 19. Orson Welles called it a masterpiece, despite Ford considering it a throwaway film. The ultimate irony of this movie's legacy is that the film John Ford was forced to make and considered beneath his talents received praise from one of cinema's greatest artists. Orson Welles, director of Citizen Kane and a filmmaker whose own perfectionism matched Ford's, called Rio Grande a masterpiece in the documentary directed by John Ford. Welles wasn't alone in his assessment when Andrew Sarris, the influential critic who championed the auteur theory in America, rated Rio Grande the best film of 1950 and ranked it above both Sunset Boulevard and All About Eve, two pictures that are generally considered landmarks of American cinema. Brian Garfield went even further and suggested it might be the best of Ford's three Cavalry films. How could a movie that was basically a paycheck, a bargaining chip to finance another project, inspire this kind of critical admiration? The answer reveals something about art and craft, because even when Ford wasn't emotionally invested in the material, his technical mastery remained intact. His eye for composition, his ability to stage action, and his skill at coaxing authentic performances didn't disappear just because he felt trapped by studio demands. Burt Glennon's black and white cinematography is stunning throughout the film. The Utah locations provide dramatic vistas that Ford captures with his characteristic sense of scale and space. The action sequences, particularly the climactic rescue raid, are expertly staged and edited, and Victor Young's score supports the emotion without overwhelming it. Every technical element works in harmony. Fact number 20. The final profit was just over $200,000, but it unlocked The Quiet Man, which earned $3.8 million. The numbers tell the whole story when you look at them. Rio Grande cost $1,214,899 to produce and earned $2,250,000 at the box office. And after Republic Pictures took their distribution fees and expenses, the net profit totaled $215,634. By any reasonable standard, that's a successful film. Republic made money, the investors were happy, and Herbert Yates got exactly what he demanded, a profitable Western that proved Ford could deliver commercial entertainment within budget. What makes those numbers truly significant, though, is that they unlocked The Quiet Man. Yates kept his word and financed Ford's passion project. The the silly Irish story he'd dismissed so contemptuously, and The Quiet Man went into production in 1951 with a budget of $1.75 million, significantly more than Rio Grande received. The Quiet Man earned $3,800,000 in its initial release and became one of Republic's biggest hits while earning Ford his fourth Academy Award for Best Director. Critics loved it, audiences loved it, and it's remained beloved for 7 decades, regularly appearing on lists of the greatest romantic films ever made. The lesson: sometimes the work we're forced to do and the compromises we're required to make turn out better than we have any right to expect. John Ford learned to stop resenting Rio Grande eventually, and recognized that even his throwaway projects had value, and we're richer for it, because we got both Rio Grande and The Quiet Man, 2 films that might seem completely different, but came from the same artistic vision. That brings us to the end of our journey through the hidden facts of Rio Grande. From John Ford's reluctance to the dangerous stunts performed without doubles, from the impossible age gaps to the Korean War parallels, this film contains more surprising stories than most people realize. If you've enjoyed discovering these secrets from behind the scenes, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and tell us when you first saw Rio Grande and what your favorite scene is. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into classic westerns and the golden age of Hollywood, because we've got plenty more stories to tell about the films and stars you grew up with. Rio Grande may have started as a film nobody wanted to make, but it became something far more valuable, a window into an era of filmmaking when directors fought for creative control, actors performed their own stunts, and every production was a small war between art and commerce. The fact that a great film emerged from such reluctance and conflict makes it all the more remarkable. Until next time, keep watching those classic westerns, because they've got more stories to tell than you might think.